The second source of information that is sometimes used by sociologists to study criminal as well as non-criminal forms of deviance is survey research. The first source of information we discussed was government data. We talked about the Uniform Crime Report and the NCVS, both of which are data sets that are associated with criminal forms of deviance. And I want to mention survey research. Survey research can be used to study both criminal and non-criminal forms of deviance, and of course it has uses outside of the field of crime and deviance, and sociologists and other social scientists use survey research to collect data on many topics, a lot of which don't have anything at all to do with deviance. That we use it to measure people's opinions on various topics, as well as trying to predict how they're going to vote and other issues as well. Now, when we're looking at survey research, there is, first of all, some type of population in which that we are interested in studying. Now, this may be college students in the United States. It might be the American population as a whole, or people who are registered voters. There's some population that we're interested in studying. And rather than interview all persons who are part of this population, what we typically will do is conduct a study of a smaller group, of a sample of this population, maybe looking at 500 or 1,000 Western students as opposed to all 20,000 students who are enrolled at this university, or maybe having a study of 1,000 or 1,500 registered voters as opposed to studying or trying to conduct a study of all registered voters in the United States. Now, if we want to, let me mention there are two primary reasons that we use a sample as opposed to interviewing everybody that's part of a given population, and that is, as you would imagine, first of all, to sample a population is cheaper. It's much cheaper to do a survey of 1,000 or 1,500 Americans as opposed to interviewing every American who is going to vote or potentially vote in a presidential election, or even a study of Western students is much cheaper, like I said, to study 1,000 as opposed to 20,000 students. And the second reason that we do this, use a sample as opposed to the full population, is that it's much quicker as well to gather information from a smaller group of a sample than is of a population. Now, what we desire to do is we want to be able to generalize from the sample to the larger population. If we want to be able to generalize from a sample to a larger population, this sample must be representative of the larger population. If our sample is not representative of the larger population, it's not scientifically useful or valid. We can't generalize from the sample to the larger population. So we need a sample. We have to have a sample that's representative of the larger population if we want to generalize to the larger population. And to have a representative sample, what we need is some type of probability sample. A random sample is one type of probability sample. There are other types that we won't discuss in this class. There are other types of probability sampling techniques that you would learn about in a methods course. So a random sample is one in which every member of the population has an equal chance of inclusion in the sample. And to talk about and illustrate the importance of having a representative sample, I want to bring to your attention, and some of you may be familiar with this already from other courses, like intro sociology or maybe intro psychology even. This is something that's often used to illustrate this point about the importance of having a representative sample. In 1936, the Literary Digest, now this was a popular magazine at the time, was interested in predicting the outcome of the 1936 presidential election. And so they took a sample of the U.S. population, a very large sample. They had a sample of over 2 million Americans. And based on the data they collected, they predicted that the winner of the 1936 presidential election would be a man by the name of Alf Landon, who I hope you know did not become president. Instead, the winner of the 1936 presidential election was FDR, Franklin Roosevelt. And you might wonder, how did they miss predicting accurately the outcome of this election when they had such a huge sample of over 2 million people? And the reason is their sample wasn't representative. They constructed their sample and their sampling frame by using automobile registrations and telephone directories. Well, in 1936, this was during the Great Depression, and so automobile registrations were definitely not representative. And even at that time, people who had telephones, who were listed in a telephone directory, would not be a random or representative sample of the U.S. population. And so their sample was biased. Now, interestingly, at that same time, a person did accurately predict the outcome of the 1936 presidential election using a sample of only a couple thousand people. That man's name was George Gallup. And many of you are probably already familiar with his last name. The Gallup polling organization, which exists to date, is one of the most prestigious polling organizations in the United States today. He was able to accurately predict the outcome of a presidential election, which millions of people are going to vote, with a sample of only a couple thousand people. And we can predict the outcome of a presidential election in which millions of people vote with a sample of only, say, 1,000 or 1,500 or 2,000 people, if we have a sample that's representative of the larger population. Now, there's a relationship between how large the sample is. We can be more accurate with in terms of our prediction with a sample of 1,500 or 2,000 than we can with a sample of 800 or 900 people. A sample of 800 or 900 people has a much larger margin of error than one that, or has a larger margin of error than one of, like, say, 1,500 or 2,000 people. And you'll see when you look at polls, if they're reported on the news, or if you're reading this in the newspaper or you see this on TV, they should have a margin of error associated with them. This is again beyond the scope of this class. This is something you would discuss more in a methods or statistics course. One of the nice things about survey methodology is that it allows us to study basically anything that we ask of people. We can ask people not only about who they're going to vote for, we can ask them about their opinions on issues like capital punishment or support for abortion, or whether they believe there should be prayer in school, or other issues that might be controversial, or even or issues that aren't controversial at all. Basically anything we can ask. And we can study types of crime and deviance through survey research that is not available to criminologists through government data like the NCVS and the Uniform Crime Report. We talked about the 8 index offenses for the Uniform Crime Report. Now there's a larger number of types of crime that are covered in the NCVS, but there are other things about which sociologists who study deviance might be interested that's not, of course, covered in government data. And so we can use this to we can use survey research to study other types of dependent variables, such as drug use among college students, or the use of alcohol and illicit drugs among high school students. We might want to study college and high school students both to measure the prevalence of cheating among high school and college students, how often they do it and in what forms they cheat on examinations or when writing papers or doing other types of academic exercises. We might ask the American population as a whole about issues associated with sexuality, their involvement in extramarital sex or premarital sex, or the number of sexual partners that they've had in their lifetime. And there have been studies of this nature as well. Now, not only does survey research allow us to study many different dependent variables that are not available to sociologists using government sources of data, we are also able, through survey research, to study independent variables that are not available to us through the Uniform Crime Report or the NCVS. As I mentioned to you in the last lecture period, in the Uniform Crime Report, we only have 3 pieces of demographic information about individuals who have been arrested for index crimes. That, as we said, Well, there are a lot of other variables, independent variables, that sociologists might want to also measure and determine whether or not they are correlated with various types of criminal or deviant behavior. In addition to those three, things like social class, or the level of educational attainment someone has achieved, or their religious background, or their family structure. Are they from intact or divorced or separated families? And so we can gather information on a host of independent variables as well that might be associated with involvement in crime and deviance that's not available to us through official government data. And so these are some of the strengths of survey research. In closing the discussion of survey research, I want to note that survey research of this type is strong on generalizability if we have a representative sample, but it is weak on validity when studying people who are involved in deviant and/or criminal behavior. So this method can be very good for studying, whether people are going to vote for a certain individual or what's their opinion on abortion or capital punishment. But when we start collecting data, asking people to self-report their involvement in criminal and non-criminal forms of deviance, we have to be somewhat suspect of the data we collect, because we have to wonder, how honest will people be when we are asking them to report whether or not they have ever cheated on their spouse or boyfriend or girlfriend, or how many times they've done that? Have they ever used certain illicit substances? And, even if they admit they have used some of these, will they be honest with us with regard to how many times in their life they have used these different substances? So there's a question about the validity of survey research when we're studying deviance and crime. The next source of information that I wanted to talk about, the third source of information that's sometimes used by sociologists in the study of deviance and crime, is participant observation field, F-I-E-L-D, research. Now, I don't have a slide for participant observation field research, so we'll go ahead and talk about this topic, but there won't be the topical outline that you have for most of the other lectures. Participant observation field research involves interacting with a group on a regular basis over an extended period of time. This may be months or even years. And so sociologists might be interested in studying some type of group that's involved in some types of deviance, and so they will become involved with that group and observe them, perhaps interview them. We'll talk about that in just a few moments as well, for an extended period of time. And this type of study can provide a very deep, accurate, rich account of the lives of people who are involved in various types of behaviors. And from these types of studies, we can learn a lot about their lives. We can learn about the groups in which they participate, how they're structured, how they're organized. We can learn about the allure of deviance or involvement in deviance for these individuals. We can also learn about how they manage the stigma and negative sanctions associated with their involvement in deviance. And think about this, how much better the information and data we would gather, let's say from strippers, would be if we were to go into a series of, or go into several strip bars in Nashville or Louisville, let's say for an extended period of time, maybe over 9 months or a year and a half, and that we go there several times. We observe these women interacting with men in these settings. We can have a better understanding of the norms that are followed in the clubs, how they interact with the men, also how they interact with one another. We can also perhaps then interview some of these women outside of the club and ask them questions about their involvement in dancing and other things about which we might be interested. And think about how much more rich, accurate, descriptive understanding we could have of these individuals' lives than from simply going to a few strip bars, handing out some surveys to dancers and asking them to fill these out and return them to us. Now, when we are involved in participant observation field research, we have to make a decision as to whether we are going to take an overt research role or a covert research role. If we take an overt research role, that means that we keep our identity as a sociologist hidden. We don't tell them we're a sociologist who is conducting research. If we take an overt research role, we do tell them that we are sociologists, and we ask basically permission to hang out with them and study them. So we take an overt role, we tell them about our affiliation with the university, the purpose of why we're hanging out with them, and seek their permission to engage in the study. If we take a covert research role, we keep our identity hidden. We don't let them know why we are where we are and that we're involved in a sociological investigation. Now, this is of course controversial. This is an ethical issue or dilemma. And this is something to do any research at a university, for any sociologist or other academic who is affiliated with a university to engage in research. This research has to be approved by the Institutional Review Board, or what's sometimes referred to as a Human Subjects Review Board, if it specifically deals with humans as opposed to animals. But here's the point I want to make. All research has to be vetted by one of these institutional review boards, and these boards will at times permit researchers to use deception in their work, provided that it is not something that's going to lead to some type of harm, physical, emotional, or other type of harm to the individuals, and provide basically that the risk of any type of harm is minimal. And this is again beyond the discussion in this class, but I just wanted to make you aware of the fact that all research has to be, even research is, of a rather innocuous level, has to be approved by the Institutional Review Board of the university, and that it is possible to get permission to use deception in one's research, provided the risks are minimal. And like I said, I don't want to go into a further discussion of all the issues associated with this. But the reason sociologists sometimes use deception, as well as psychologists, and some other types of social sciences and behavioral sciences, is that, first of all, there are two reasons that we sometimes use deception as opposed to being overt. And here's the problem. If we are overt, there are two possible problems. First, the group may deny us entry. We might say, I am Matt Pruitt from Western Kentucky University, Sociology Department. I was wondering if I could hang out with y'all over the next few months or year, interview some of you, and get to better understand how your lives are structured and so forth. Well, some people might say no, and so that's the end of that. The second problem is that even if a group says, yes, hang out with us, you can study us, we'd be glad to have you in our midst, the second problem is that people often alter their behavior if they know they're being studied. And so maybe when the sociologist is around, they don't do certain things, or they act differently, or they try to put forth, they make an effort to have their best image, to construct an image that's more positive than would otherwise be the case. So the sociologist may not be able to observe everything that occurs among this group, and people may not act naturally, and they may alter their actions in such a way that will distort the findings of what would otherwise be the case if the sociologist had been able to use a covert research role. And I'll just mention some examples of studies. The research you're going to read this semester in this course is largely of this type, participant observation field research. Most of the research in the field of deviance, social deviance, is participant observation field research. And you're going to read some very interesting studies during the course of the semester. You'll read about a study by Hopper and Moore that looks at the role of women in outlaw motorcycle gangs. You will also read a study by the Adlers, who studied drug dealers in Southern California. Now, they took both a covert research role with some people, and they took a covert research role with some people, and an overt research role with others. And in their study, they talk about the difficulty, both for themselves and for some of their participants, when they are covert with some individuals and overt with others. You'll read an interesting study by a woman who was in graduate school in sociology, and to pay for her graduate work, she worked as a stripper, and she used also this experience not just to earn money to pay for graduate school, but she also used the experience of working in this setting as a way to collect data for her either master's thesis or PhD dissertation. Now, she took a covert research role with regard to the other dancers in the club. They did not know that she was a sociologist. They did not know that her work there and her interaction with them was involved in a sociological study of dancers, and specifically the article you'll read is an article in which she talks about the ways in which dancers often interact with men in order to get more money from them, to get larger tips. And she'll talk about a practice that's referred to as counterfeit intimacy. I will discuss with you during this exam period on another day an article by Rockford. Rockford studied the Hare Krishna, and he took an overt research role when studying this group. But you'll see when I discuss this that even though he was overt and told them the intent of his study, this religious group thought, they knew differently, that they thought he was sent there by God or consciousness to study, not to study them, but to become a member, and some of the issues that arose because of their perception of knowing this. But also you'll see in this study, when they knew he was studying them, and also a sociologist, they started to look and sometimes watch him to see if there were any signs of his conversion. I'll talk more about that at another time. The next thing that I want to note is that what I said about survey research with regard to generalizability and validity, the opposite of that is true when we talk about participant observation field research. Participant observation field research is weak on generalizability because we don't have representative samples, or it's very rare that we ever have a representative sample. And so we have this problem. It's weak on generalizability because typically we don't have representative samples, therefore we can't generalize to the larger population. But it's strong on validity when studying deviant populations. So that's opposite of what we said with regard to survey research, because we can get a much more rich, accurate description and understanding of the lives of drug dealers or women in outlaw motorcycle gangs or strippers or whoever it might be that we want to study by engaging in participant observation field research than simply handing them a questionnaire. Now, the reason these studies are weak on generalizability is because we don't have a list of women who are in outlaw motorcycle gang. We don't have a list. There's no directory of people who are involved in swinging or using drugs or who are runaways. And so the way in which we collect a sample, or construct a sample rather, is different than it is in participant observation field research. We don't have representative samples. We don't have probability sampling techniques that are available to us because we don't have any kind of lists that we can use to construct some type of probability sample. Instead, the type of sample that we have in participant observation field research is what's known as and referred to as a snowball sample. A snowball sample begins with a key informant, someone who's involved in some type of social group. In this case, in this course, someone who's involved in some type of deviance. So this key informant, who's an initial contact, puts us in connection with others, who then lead us to others, and so forth and so on. And that's how this sample gets constructed. The Adlers, who studied drug dealers in Southern California, their key informant was a man named Dave, a guy in their neighborhood who had a nice house, nice car, didn't ever go to work. A lot of people stopped by his house a lot. He lived a pretty decent lifestyle, had a lot of people stopping by, made them wonder maybe he's a drug dealer. They found out that he was. Well, if you're involved in drug dealers, as a drug dealer, you're going to know other people who are involved in this trade and people who are users as well. And so that gave them access to this subculture. He could introduce them to other people who introduced them to others, and that's how their sample was built. There's a study I talked about in my sexuality class by a man by the name of Allen. He studied male street and other forms of male prostitutes in Boston back in the 1980s or 90s. I think it was in the 1980s. Yeah, it was. And so he initially met this first person who's involved in male prostitution through a clinic where he was working as a doctor. And this kid then was able to introduce him to others who were involved in this lifestyle. And that was how he was able to construct the sample for his study. Because people who are involved in some form of deviance are going to know others who are involved in these subcultures, and then they can provide contacts, and samples are built this way. So since it's weak on generalizability, again, the reason is we don't have representative samples. If I were to start studying strippers in Nashville, I can't generalize from a study of women who work at strip bars in Nashville to say that this is going to be true of strippers who work in other cities, in other parts of the country, over different time periods. There may be some things that are unique about Nashville and in terms of the women who are working here, but also in terms of the customers. You have to think about the social class and racial and ethnic makeup of the customers, as well as of the dancers themselves, and other factors that might be unique to a given setting. Even if I were to study all the strippers or all the clubs in Nashville or some other city. And so since that's not a representative sample, we can't generalize from a given participant observation field research, whether it's of women in outlaw motorcycle gangs or strippers or people who smoke marijuana, to all people of that type. And the way we are able to generalize and get some type of confidence in our results that there are certain things that are true about certain populations or certain groups or subcultures who are involved in some forms of deviance is when we see that there are regularities and consistencies in findings across studies that cover different geographic locations and different time periods. When we start to see these regularities, these consistencies in findings across studies covering different geographic periods, geographic areas and time periods, then we can have confidence that this is true of this group in terms of their norms, in terms of how the behaviors are structured, in terms of how these subcultures are organized. So it's only through finding consistency across studies that we can have greater confidence in the generalizability of the data that we are able to collect through the method of participant observation field research.